Hello, Dr. Julian. My name's Connor Gill, and I'm going to be performing The Passing by Durango Mendoza. Ever since Mama married Edmund, we lived in the country. He had built a tall, single-walled, two-room house on the land of his family above the big bend of Fish Creek, and it stood there, lean and unpainted among the trees back from the road. Right across the land was the Indian church. One evening, as I played cards with pieces of wood in the dust beside the house, Mama saw the boy coming along the road. I gazed upon her view and gazed beyond. Through the shadows and trees, I saw how the road curved and disappeared quickly into the dust of the woods. I looked back to her when she spoke. "Sonny, there goes Joe Willow." Then she paused and put the shirt she was holding into her basket at her feet. "He sure does work hard. I hope Jimmy Bear and Fanny appreciated those two." She shook her head and began to gather the rest of the clothes. I sat back on my heels and wondered at the tone of her voice. I had never really noticed Joe Willow before, and I knew the rest of the family from church meetings, and once I had seen where they lived. Joe Willow's mother, Fanny, was a short, round woman with mottled brown skin and a high, shiny forehead that wrinkled when she laughed. Jimmy Bear was her second husband, and they used to pass our house often on their way to town. Jimmy Bear was a skinny man, but he had a round, protruding belly and wore his belt under it so it looked like as if he carried a basketball inside. He had gaps in his teeth and a rough, guttered laugh and walked with a shuffle. Mama told me that Fanny had once had money, but since then it's been long gone. The next evening when Joe Willow passed the gate, I got up and ran to hang on it as I watched him pass the road. I could hear the crunch and whisper of his footsteps between the squeaks of the bucket he carried until they began to fade along the coming of the breeze through the tall grass alongside the road. "Hello, Joe Willow." He squinted into the sun and smiled. And he turned back up the road and soon faded into the shadow of the trees. Almost every evening of August that summer, the young Indian man passed along the road in front of our gate. I saw him several times a week as he came up from the bridge. He walked slowly, without spirit, with the strength seen in a young workhorse. Many evenings I swung back and forth on the gate and waited for him to come by. I had no brothers or sisters yet, but Mama was expecting Edmund's first child before spring. Edmund was my stepfather, and since he said very little to me, and because I couldn't be around Mama all the time, I waited for Joe Willow to pass by, although I seldom spoke, just to reply to his greetings. I remember one of the last times I saw him. It was early in September, and I was sitting on the gate watching the sun caught on the treetops, noticing how the leaves looked like embers across its face and settled into them when Joe Willow appeared like a moving post upon the road. I had just gotten down from the gate and sat on a large rock that popped up our mailbox when Edmund called me for supper. Instead, I began to sift sand into the conical piles as I waited. I looked down the road, past the young worker to where the sun had fallen behind the trees. It looked trapped. The wind was very soft and smelled of smoke and dust. A few birds chuckled above me in the trees, and the insects of the evening buzzed in the weeds below. Edmund called again. I looked up. "Howdy, Joe Willow. You coming home from work?" He stopped and grinned. "That's right." He leaned on the mailbox and we said nothing for a few moments. "You're Edmund's boy, aren't you?" "Uh-uh. I belong to Rosa." "Oh." He squatted down. "You know what? I'm the same way. Everybody calls me Jimmy Bear's boy, but I'm not. He's not my daddy." We both shifted and watched where the sun had gone down. "You see what happens when the sun goes down?" He pointed to the evening star and motioned toward the stars that had appeared in the east. "When the daddy goes to bed, all the little children come out." His teeth gleamed in gathering darkness, and I smiled too. We had watched the stars for only a moment when Edmund called again. "You better get on home. That's your daddy calling you. I'm Rose's boy." "I know, but you better get on back." He looked up again at the deepening sky and laughed softly. "I'll see you some other time, Rose's boy." After September came, I started school and no longer saw Joe Willow pass our gate. One day I asked Mama about him, and she said that he had gone to the free Indian boarding school of the northern part of the state, just south of the Kansas line. It was when winter was just melting into spring, a few weeks after Mama had returned from the hospital with my baby brother, that I remembered him again. Just before supper, Edmund came into the kitchen, stamping the bits of dirty snow from his overshoes. "Jimmy Bear's boys been killed by the Santa Fe train, but they say they ain't sure how it happened." He warmed his hands over the stove and sat down. I looked at Mama. She said nothing and just rocked the baby. On the stove, the beans bubbled softly, and their smell filled the room. I watched the lid on the pot jiggle as the stream escaped, and I heard the wind rattle gently at the window. Edmund struggled with his overshoes and continued. Fanny told me a railroad man was down the first thing, and they said they was willing to pay. The funeral's Tuesday. At the funeral, Joe Willow's family cried, and old Fanny even fainted at the grave when they saw him cover Joe Willow. Jimmy Bear had to struggle to keep her from falling. That evening after summer, I stepped into the back stoop, and the yellow lamplight behind me threw my shadow onto the patches of snow and earth, enclosing it in the rectangle that the doorway formed. I looked up. The spotty clouds looked like bits of melting snow pressed into the darkness, and the stars were out, sprinkled into the stillness beyond. The black trees swayed, and the cold winter was familiar. Behind me, Mama moved around the kitchen, and I heard the chink and gentle clatter of the plates and pans as she put those things away. I shivered, and I knew that soon, as it did every spring, the clouds would come in and it would begin to rain. A cold, heavy drizzle. The land would turn to mud.